A lot of the message of GamerGate has been lost through misinformation. Perhaps you heard about it on the news or read an article and found the message to be oddly split. They claim it to be one thing, but looking at the hashtag on Twitter shows something completely different. What's the real story here? Well, I'll tell you. GamerGate is a consumer revolt against corrupt and biased journalists in the games media. Doesn't sound like what you've heard, does it? That's because what we have to say is damaging to them and they don't want it to be talked about. But this has been going on for 2 months, and the Twitter hashtag is nearing 2 million tweets. There's only so long that the media can keep telling the public that there's nothing here and don't look further into it. The fact that you're watching this video proves that. See, we actually have evidence behind our claims. Evidence that the media is desperate to ensure doesn't get out. So, firstly, despite GamerGate officially starting in August, the first piece of evidence comes from 2012. A games reviewer, Jeff Gerstmann, was fired after giving a game a poor review whilst the publisher was running an ad campaign on the site. The poor review affected ad revenue and the site chose profits over fair consumer advocacy. This same approach was seen again with Rob Florence calling out the questionable ethics of Jeff Keighley, who spoke on an upcoming game sat next to incredibly obvious product placements, and the actions of Lauren Wainwright in regards to a competition to win a PlayStation 3. Legal threats were made against Florence, causing him to quit the industry. Those two events should help provide an understanding of how the environment of the games media developed up till now. Those who didn't toe the party line were fired or bullied out, leaving a questionable number of people behind who clearly didn't have their readers in mind. This brings us to 2012, though still not to GamerGate yet. There's one more event that is noteworthy. At the beginning of the year, a charity event called the Fine Young Capitalists was started with the intent of getting more women into the games industry. This charity was attacked by Zoe Quinn and her Twitter followers, leading to the charity organizer's personal information being spread. When the charity organizer tried contacting the games media about this, they were met with silence and responses of, "We trust Zoe's opinion and won't report on it." This is the issue of cronyism that GamerGate is trying to point out to the public. Someone couldn't get their story out because of a pre-existing friendship between the journalist and the person guilty of the accusations. Now we come to August 2014, where GamerGate begins to gain traction. A blog post was published detailing the relationship between Zoe Quinn and a number of games journalists. In response to this, a YouTuber named Mundane Matt made a video discussing the blog, and in turn had his video illegally DMCA'd by Zoe Quinn. Total Biscuit, another prominent YouTube personality, spoke up on this illegal DMCA, having been the recipient of a few in the past. Interestingly, none of the games media chose to discuss this illegal DMCA, despite many of them having discussed the ones that Total Biscuit received in the past. A Reddit post was made, furthering the discussion until all 25,000 comments were mass deleted by the moderators, though no reason was given as to why the comments were purged. Now there is a thing called the Streisand effect, which essentially means that when something is censored from the public eye, people will gain a vested interest in discovering why. This was the spark that motivated people to investigate further. Upon finding the restarted charity that Zoe attacked earlier that year, GamerGaters began donating to it en masse, impressed by its goals and annoyed that someone tried to shut it down for no good reason. Unfortunately, the Fine Young Capitalists met resistance again, this time having their site hacked. I find it ironic that many of the accused games journalists have written articles claiming GamerGate to be attempting to drive women out of the industry, when right here we have an example that it is those who oppose GamerGate doing so. And again, none of the games media decided a charity for women being hacked was newsworthy. I think it's clear now that they control the narrative and only report on what helps them. The charity thankfully got control of their site back, and with the help of GamerGate reached their goal over the coming weeks. Now, despite what the media wants you to believe, this is where Zoe Quinn's involvement ends. Her story gave us a glimpse into the corrupt world of the games media, but as more evidence emerged, it dwarfed what we found here. What was uncovered next was a slew of evidence of these journalists financially supporting the people they wrote about on Patreon and writing about people that they had personal ties to. I won't list all of them for the sake of time, but I will link some of them in the description below. And in response to them, an interview that was held with Greg Lisby, a university professor in journalism ethics, should sum it up better than I could.
Would you say that funding a source's creative projects crosses that line?
Absolutely. No doubt in my mind whatsoever. If you're the writer and I'm the inventor, or I'm the creator here in some way, and somehow we have a monetary relationship that is, we hope, going to result in my success, then for you to write about me, that's unethical.
Now, what about being roommates with a potential source?
I was asking even worse. Now, I have heard in the political realm where people say, oh, I'm a political operative for this person, and she's a political operative for this person, and oh, we don't do things like that. But I think it's going to create problems.
And I guess, what do you consider a sexual relationship crossing that line as well?
Absolutely.
What the games media chose to do in response to us digging up their unethical behaviour was amazing. On August 28th, within the span of 24 hours, 11 articles were released, all saying that gamers are dead and they don't have to be your audience anymore. I want to add some context to this, in that these are games media websites. Their audience are gamers, and they are saying that they are a terrible demographic. Of course gamers are pissed from this. But there was more to the gamers' anger than just having their identity tarnished. In the articles they described all gamers as fitting into the demographic of straight white males. They could not have misunderstood their audience further. From this, the Not Your Shield project was born. Gamers who were of a different skin colour, or who were women, or even who weren't straight or were trans banded together to show the journalists that they were wrong. The response from the journalists and those who opposed Gamergate was frankly disgusting. People told members of Not Your Shield that they didn't exist, and when they proved that they in fact did, the response was that they were misguided or too stupid to understand the situation. Again, the side that accuses Gamergate of being misogynistic and racist needed to revert to 1950s style thought in order to prove themselves right. During this time, some investigation into the Indicator Awards turned up more corruption. Phil Fish, the creator of Fez, won awards in 2011 and 2012, winning the grand prize during the latter. It was later found that some of the judges on the panel for the award were also investors in the game and had a stake in its success. While it is tangential to Gamergate, it is interesting how much corruption has been uncovered just by looking for it, something the game's journalists should have been doing. One other thing happened during this time. A whistleblower for EA came out stating that Kotaku allegedly helped EA cover up and keep quiet a hack that occurred in 2013 that compromised 40,000 user accounts. Again, a theme that keeps running through all these cases is that the games media does not put the interests, or in this case the safety of their personal information, of their readers first. What benefits them or their friends determines what is published. Now this is where things begin to ramp up. The journalist Milo Yiannopoulos had been investigating the claims of Gamergate, and he uncovered some quite damning evidence. He found the Game Journo Pro's mailing list, a mailing list inspired by the infamous Journo list from a few years back. On it, there was clear evidence that journalists from many websites discussed how they would report on topics, and even in a few cases were bullied to censor forum discussion or alter their opinion on a topic by members of a competing website. How does this affect the industry? There have been instances in the past where game developers' bonus has been tied to receiving a Metacritic score of 85 or higher. If the journalists are colluding and they dislike a company, they could financially affect them by only giving an 80. Essentially, corruption is near impossible in a free market, and the collusion on this mailing list does not lead to a free market. Now, ever since the Gamers Are Dead articles, Gamergate has been emailing advertisers as a form of boycott. A few advertisers have responded with agreement and pulled their ads from these sites. Some who oppose Gamergate have claimed that this is us trying to censor opinions that we do not agree with. To that, I will point you to Total Biscuit and what he has to say on the matter.
I'd like to take the opportunity to disagree with Greg's point of view when it comes to the idea of boycott and the idea of, say, pulling ads and actually emailing advertisers. My perspective on this is a little bit different because I operate a lot in the esports scene, and I've run an esports team for the last couple of years, and I've been involved in the Pro StarCraft scene for 5. And emailing sponsors when players behave in a particularly bad way is actually very common, and it's a fairly accepted way of people doing business. Now, when it comes to a larger industry such as this, we have this idea of asymmetry, we have this idea of consumer power, and the few things that a consumer can actually do, because a consumer doesn't have a very loud voice versus a website like, say, Polygon that has a very loud voice because they have a large audience. They have a pedestal and a megaphone, one might say. That's a term that's been bandied around a lot. They have a megaphone. So when their concerns are not addressed, and when people refuse to engage with them, as Eric was mentioning earlier, the way to diffuse a lot of this is to engage with people, they will resort to one of the few powers that they have as a consumer, which is the idea of the boycott. And it's to say, look, we, advertiser, we are part of your demographic. This website is representing you, because that's how sponsorship works. When I speak, I represent the sponsors of my esports team, whether I like it or not. And I have to always bear that in mind whenever I say anything. So as a result, we don't like what's being said here. Here are the reasons why. And we feel this is of concern. Now, Intel obviously believed that it was of enough concern to pull an advertising campaign from one website. One, I might add. That's not actually that many. Intel sponsor a great deal of things. But I do not agree with the idea that a boycott is censorship. I believe that that's consumer activism, because it's really one of the few weapons that you have when you try and address these people and you try and post your concern on the website. That concern is deleted and you're banned from the site, and discussion is it's almost like boycott became a last resort because they weren't able to have a voice, and this is the only way that some people could think of doing it.
So, a few weeks after the Game Journo Pro's leak, Intel responded to the emails by pulling their ads from Gamasutra. After all, Intel's main demographic overlaps heavily with gamers, and Gamasutra was one of the sites that ran a Gamers Are Dead article. In response to this, many of the other journalist websites attacked Intel for this decision, claiming it to be sexist and validating the joke that is Gamergate. This may be the point where you began hearing about Gamergate, as this is where the opposing side made a real push into mainstream media. Many news outlets covered the story, but unfortunately most sourced their research from the game's media, and as such only covered one side. That is, until finally one of them wanted to hear our side. Ricky Camilleri of the Huffington Post Live gave 3 women, 2 pro-Gamergate and 1 neutral, a chance to give our side of the story. And they did an amazing job. I would highly recommend you go watch it. Recently, Sam Biddle of Gawker Media posted a few tweets about Gamergate in which he advocated bringing back bullying against gamers. If this showed one thing, it's that we don't even have to do anything. These people will bring themselves down in an effort to attack us. In response to this tweet, Mercedes-Benz pulled advertising from Gawker, expressing that they took bullying seriously and didn't want to be associated with that. Gamergate's response to Sam Biddle's tweet was to raise money for an anti-bullying charity. We managed to raise $16,000 for the Pacer National Bullying Prevention Center. That almost brings us up to where we are now, save for one more event. It is still being verified, so take this story with a grain of salt, but reports have come out recently that a former writer at Destructoid was fired and blacklisted based on recommendations from the Game Journo pros. Again, this is the biggest issue of Gamergate. The Game Journo pros have established a control over the industry, and it is no longer a free market. So this is where we are now, still opposing corrupt journalists who prove themselves to be the worst kind of people each day, and trying to get our voice heard over the constant misinformation and lies. If your response to this is, who cares, it's just games journalism, it doesn't affect me, then to that I say, if we can't clean up games journalism, what chance do other mediums have? One last point to end on. WikiLeaks has shown support for Gamergate. If there's one opinion you should trust on identifying corruption, it's